Before them loomed the mountain, as though the bedrock of the world had buckled and risen in silent fury against what approached. Veiled in a ghost-white fog, its summit tore into the sky, a fang of ice defying the heavens. It was quite the sight, Rian had thought. He found it strange that it had not shown itself once during his trip, not even before they had reached the bridge. It was as if it had been purposefully hidden amongst the mists and fog that covered the continent. They had decided to take a short rest whilst they could. Garth was currently lying down, using his cloak as a makeshift pillow to place his head on, and was breathing slowly, deep in sleep. A few of the elves had again taken up positions around the area that they had all set up in. It was clear to Rian that these prisoners that he had released seemed to fall back into whatever roles that they were given just before they had been captured by his men. Adora twisted a branch at the small, weak fire she had created from whatever lay around them, making it spark and hiss. Rian sat across from her, elbows on his knees and his head within his hands. They had not said a word to one another since they had decided to stop. Beside him lay the sword that he had taken from the armory, the sword he had once felt comfortable wielding, but now had begun to feel unsteady and strange. Adora turned her gaze to the sword that lay beside Rian and pointed the stick she held towards it. "That sword," she began to say. Rian raised his head, taken slightly aback by the fact they were now about to talk to one another. "What?" he replied, not fully understanding what she had just said. She pointed once again. Rian took hold of the sword in its scabbard and laid it flat along his knees. He rubbed his hand across the rough leather of the scabbard a few times before taking hold of it and handing it towards Adora. "This is yours, is it not?" he spoke. She did not react. "You know it's not," she said back to him, looking back into the fire and poking its flames with the stick again. There it was, another riddle for him to unfold in his thoughts. He was getting increasingly frustrated at how Adora was cautiously avoiding giving answers to what Rian thought had been absolutely normal questions. He finally felt he'd had enough. He let go of the sword, and it clattered to the ground, startling Adora. "Then tell me!" he yelled, the elves around him turning to face the unexpected yell. She sighed and got to her feet, slowly walking up to him. She then knelt and took hold of the sword that lay on the ground. She brushed off the dust and dirt that covered it and proceeded to draw the blade from its sheath. "Take it," she said to Rian, holding the blade itself and handing him the hilt. He did. They both rose to their feet, and Adora stepped back a few paces, allowing Rian to breathe. "Tell me, how does it feel?" she spoke. The firelight reflected off the polished metal of the blade that he held out in front of him. For a brief moment, Rian could almost see another pair of hands holding it, younger hands. His hands. The image faded as soon as he had seen it, and he lowered the blade. "It feels—" he began to say, but knew that he had said the wrong words. "It's mine, isn't it?" It wasn't a question he had asked, but more of a statement. A fact. He had known deep within him that this blade was his. Adora closed her eyes. Relief washed across her face, and for a moment she looked as though she might cry. "Yes," she spoke, just one word. "Yes." Rian did not have to question her on it, for it might have been the one honest thing that she had finally said to him. They both smiled at one another. "Told you!" A voice came from beside them. Garth had rolled over to face them both. He was still lying down, arms folded across his chest, before turning back over to sleep. Both Rian and Adora suddenly found themselves in a quiet, hysterical laughter. Rian could feel his eyes watering up. Whether this was due to exhaustion, stress, joy, or sadness, he could not tell, but it felt natural. Their laughter gradually died away. The fire crackled between them, and they both sat on the ground beside one another. He looked at her bright green eyes. "How do you know me?" he asked, a question he felt he should have asked the moment things between them felt strange. But she did not answer, merely looked into his eyes as he did hers. It was a feeling that came first, a feeling of familiarity. Somehow he knew he had seen these eyes before, somewhere in his past. But where? Adora's eyebrows began to frown. She desperately wanted Rian to come to the conclusion himself, but the more he did not respond, the more she knew within herself that he was just not quite all there yet. His mouth was open as if he wanted to speak, but no words left his lips. Adora turned away towards the fire. Rian, too, stared into the flames. "I'm sorry," he muttered, feeling the disappointment he had created by not giving her an answer. Adora turned her head to face the gray sky overhead and sighed. "The first time we met," she said softly, her mind vanishing into deep thought. Rian turned to face her, listening intently as she laughed before she spoke. "You fell out of that damn tree." Rian frowned, trying to picture the scene in his mind, but all he was seeing was a made-up fragment currently. You swore it was the tree's fault, cursing and spitting at it," she continued, laughing to herself. The image it was creating, however, was pleasant. She looked at him longingly, eyes wet with tears. "Gods above, we've been friends since childhood," she suddenly said, wiping her arm across both of her eyes. Rian did not respond. He looked into the fire and began to try to think deeply about what he had been told ever since he had awoken. The peoples of Nostrudor definitely knew who he was. That was surely true, but then, if that was the case, how could this elven girl who clearly felt something towards him have known him from childhood? It just did not add up. He was more inclined to believe and trust Adora somehow. Something about the way she held herself around him, about how compassionate she sounded when speaking to him, felt more trustworthy than anything Varric, Sigrid, or even Zarek had told him. "Then why don't I remember?" Rian said to her. Her hand slowly reached towards his head, making him flinch a little. Her hand then grazed gently over the area in which his wound lay, and then brushed past his ears, before returning her hand to her lap. "You will," she replied softly. Adora gently nudged him with her shoulder. "There was this one time, probably just a few years ago. I don't know why this is on my mind, but anyway." Rian listened closely. "We had just returned from an outing. I think it was some sort of raid, I don't remember fully. But when we got back, the people flocked to you. And only you. They were all asking, 'Oh, is he okay? Is he hurt?'" Rian looked again into the fire. "I was behind you, cleaning off black blood from my blade. No one had even noticed me following behind. It was fine, though. I was used to it." Rian could sense that she was telling the truth, about being used to people not noticing her. Adora then turned to face him. "But you were constantly looking behind at me, making sure I still followed. Do you remember what you said then?" she asked. Rian shook his head. "You were saying to everyone around you that I was the real hero, that without me you would not have made it back in one piece." She smiled at him lovingly. "You were always singing my praises, even when no one wanted to hear them." There was a silence that fell upon them for a moment. Adora sniffed and wiped her eyes dry again. "Sorry, that was slightly embarrassing," she said, trailing off into a laugh. "No," Rian replied. "No, it was sweet. I'm just sorry I can't remember it." Adora placed her hand upon his knee. "You apologize a lot, you know that?" He fought with the temptation to say sorry to this too. Instead, he nodded. "Is that why you came for me?" He spoke. She looked at him, confused. "When my men and I found you at the encampment, just before you were captured?" He could see something in her eyes that seemed to show what he was saying did not make sense fully. "No, that's not quite," she began to say. "You were taken from us, days ago." She turned to face Garth, who was still lying on the ground facing away. Him too, I think. It began to make sense. Rian had always thought Adora and Garth knew each other, or at least knew of one another. The looks, the whispered conversations, it all made sense now. "Wait, Garth was taken too?" he exclaimed, looking over at his friend. "Not from our encampment, no, but before, quite a while before." She looked sad, as if seeing something in her mind that upset her. With the way the people of Nostrudor spoke about the elves, it's no wonder there had been more than one attack in the past. But what he didn't understand is how Garth didn't know anything about what had happened, and what had caused him to begin to remember. But it suddenly dawned upon him. What was the one thing connecting the past and what they had been through? Adora. The talks that she and Garth had must have been similar to the ones she and Rian were having currently, nothing too revealing, but just enough to bring forth fragments of memories of a time forgotten. "So, how long have I been gone?" Rian asked her, silently dreading the answer. Adora looked up at the sky again, thinking. "At least 14 moons passed." Rian took in a large gulp. If what she was saying was true, he'd been taken from his people for weeks. But then, why did he only remember the past few days? Did the people of Nostrudor purposefully keep him unconscious? There was a lot more to this story than he thought that even Adora knew. "And what of Garth?" he asked her. She looked over to him. "I do not know fully. In fact, I do not even recognize him. It was he that came to me, remember?" Rian had recalled the moments after the execution at the gates, and how he had found Garth in the dungeons talking to her, holding something in his hand. "The necklace!" Rian suddenly exclaimed. Adora placed her hand to her neck, almost expecting something to be there. "Yes," she spoke. "It was mine, but Garth had taken it from me. When he came to me in the dungeons, he said that the crest that was carved on it looked strangely familiar to him." Rian also looked over at Garth. I knew then that this boy was somehow part of the bigger tale that was unfolding within the streets of wherever we were being held. Rian swiftly reacted to these words. "You mean Nostrador?" he asked her. She winced slightly and looked towards the north where the bridge lay under the thick mist. "That's not Nostrador." Rian stood up from where he was sitting and could see Adora saying something and pointing to the west, but he could not focus. "Not Nostrador?" he whispered to himself. Garth suddenly jolted upright, and the elves surrounding him also stood still. They all had heard something in the mists. "If that wasn't Nostrador, then—" he said to Adora, but she was staring towards Garth and the other elves. One of his eyes settled on where they all were staring. A solitary figure emerged from the mist, broad-shouldered, tall. A sword hung loosely in one hand. The figure took another step forward, then another. Rian felt his stomach drop. No. There, standing at the edge of the camp, was Varric.